So we will begin where we left off. If organic evolution is occurring, the question then becomes, how does this happen? What is the mechanism that resulted in the evolution of life on Earth? And so this is the second half of what Darwin did. And he was very good at kind of synthesizing things that he saw and kind of putting them all together into a big picture. He published Origin of the Species in 1859, and it has been tested ever since. And we've been finding out more and more information about what Darwin wrote and whether or not is correct. And almost across the board, it was just correct. He did such a good job. He did such deep research. It really is remarkable in the realm of science to have something that was done so thoroughly and so well, and that has stood the test of time for so long. So let's take a look at that. Natural selection observations. So populations of organisms, and remember, populations are all of the members of a species living in an area, all the members of a species living in an area. Populations of organisms display a variety of characteristics, and you just have to look around at a room full of people to see that, or to a group of dogs or birds, or really any organism, trees. Some of those characteristics might be useful, some of them are not useful, sometimes they're actually detrimental. And that variety we now know is reflected in an organism's genes. And one of the things Darwin did not know was he didn't know anything about genetics. So his understanding of how that would work was sketchy at best. And so this is a place where science has really been able to fill in the gaps over the last 150 plus years. So new genes, it turns out, provide variety. New genes come from mutation. Most people have heard of mutation, but also from other things that happen during cell replication, including duplication. We can have an exchange of genes. For example, viruses get into your cells and take over, and sometimes they can leave things behind. But more commonly, we can see an exchange of genes between similarly related organisms. So in plants, for example, closely related plants can take on genes from pollen that might land on their flowers. And we also see new information coming in from symbiotic relationships, which we may touch on a little bit later in this if we have time. But the takeaway from this is there are many places where you can get new genetic material, and mutation is just one of those. Your genes, or any organism's genes, are passed on to its offspring during reproduction. So what does this look like? Well, in this case, it shows the development of a limb, in this case, a chicken wing. All of the key stages in the development of the wing skeleton happen inside the egg, and this is all directed by the genetic code. But there are a couple of parts of the genetic code that are important here. Number one is there are some genes that you might think of as blueprint genes. And the blueprint genes say one big bone, two medium-sized bones, and then a bunch of little bones, as we mentioned in the previous slide session. But there are other genes that turn the blueprint genes on and off during development, and those will determine the length, size, shape, number of the bones in this case. And so we can see the expression of those genes varies. One of the things that can happen is a slight alteration in a gene can produce, in this case, more finger bones. The blueprint genes are the same. The trigger genes are what are changing in this case. So it's triggering the addition of more finger bones. Now, we have this variety. What happens with that variety? Well, the first thing Darwin did was he lived on a he was a gentleman farmer, if you will. But he lived on a farm and he observed the animals, the domesticated plants and animals, and how they were bred by farmers to favor certain characteristics. So we have lots and lots of cows, but if you look at a milk cow versus a cow that we breed for meat, they're actually quite a bit different in some of their specific characteristics. If we have a cow that produces a lot of milk, that cow we want to breed with the male relatives of other cows that produce a lot of milk. And so we can select for specific characteristics. So artificial selection is simply what we do when we breed organisms. And you can see how that can play out to a very extreme level when you look at the different varieties of dogs we have. Dogs are all the same species, but they have been bred very carefully to produce some very different characteristics. So Darwin said, look, if people can do that, if people can artificially select, nature can do the same thing. Nature also provides opportunities and stresses for living organisms. And an ecological niche that opens up provides a new opportunity, something that can eat whatever food is available in there, for example, or stress on an existing niche, maybe a drought. Those things are going to enhance this natural process of selection. So an example that comes to mind is the eye. Now you'll notice up at the top, the organism that they show up there is called a limpet. It is a kind of a simple sort of an organism that lives in the ocean. And a limpet is like a kind of a mollusk, as is a nautilus and a scallop. And you'll notice that each of those three organisms have different types of eyes. Their eyes all take in light. They all allow that organism to be a little more successful in its niche. But each eye works in a slightly more complicated way and provides more information for the organism. And a human eye is actually very similar in structure, but even more complex. So, what happens with natural selection is that populations of a species, so the members of a species living in an area, can become isolated either by geography or behavior, and that allows them to do some kind of interbreeding in a smaller gene pool. They're isolated, which makes the enhancement of some specific characteristics possible and indeed more likely to occur because you have a relatively limited exchange of genes. So that's basically what natural selection is. It is what happens in the barnyard, what people do with farm animals and with farm plants, but it's happening out in nature. And actually, when it happens out in nature, it takes longer because nature is messy. And a population can become isolated for a little while and then mix back in with the rest of its species, or mix back in with another population of the same species, mixes the genes back up again, and some of the characteristics that were becoming enhanced then get kind of washed back into the general gene pool and become less common. So the way natural selection works is that the natural environment provides conditions that result in evolution through the process of natural selection. Populations of organisms display variety as a result of genetic change and something that we're not going to talk about in depth, symbiogenesis. Organisms with favorable characteristics for their niche are more likely to thrive and reproduce, while organisms with unfavorable characteristics are less likely to thrive and produce. Over time, those favorable characteristics are going to accumulate until the members of the population can no longer reproduce with the population from which they became isolated. And that is when you have what we would refer to as a new species. The finches on the island of Galapagos are very often used as an example of how this works. And they were really the inspiration, one of the inspirations, I should say, for Darwin. All those finches have different shaped heads and beaks, and they allow them to take advantage of different food resources. And in this case, the finches were not geographically isolated. They were simply isolated by behavior. The finches that could take care of one type of food were more likely to hang out with and interbreed with finches who had a similar characteristic. So the cactus and seed finches that you see in the lower left were living around cactuses, and therefore they were more likely, when it came time to breed with the other finches that were living around those cactuses. So that is not a physical isolation in terms of they're in completely different places. It's more of a behavioral isolation. And so all this results in our evolutionary trends of divergence and speciation. And the way speciation works is that a population has a gene pool. The members of that population interbreed, and if they become isolated from others of their species, that gene pool basically becomes focused and allows them to develop on a separate track from other members of their species. And these populations can be selected not only through stress, we usually think of the ones that aren't fit enough die off, but opportunity. So they go to a new location because they can eat a certain kind of a seed, for example, that other members of their species can't. And so those seed-eating birds become a population and become potentially a new species due to opportunity, not necessarily because the rest of the birds died out. Now, some stresses can result in extinction. And if you look at this second bullet, as a species or a population develops a new set of characteristics, at some point, we would say, biologically speaking, it's so different, it's not the species it used to be. And this would be many generations down the line that this happens. In the fossil record, we would find fossils of these organisms, and we would say, hey, they look like that older organism, but they're not the same. They're a new species. So we would say that old species has gone extinct. It doesn't mean that something happened that killed them all off. It just means, in this case, that that population over time and many generations develop these new characteristics to the point where we just don't recognize them as the species they used to be. So we've looked a little bit at phylogeny last week and how we determine the relationships between organisms. And one of the discussions that happens in evolution is, do these changes happen quickly, or do they happen in a slow and steady way? And probably the correct answer is a little bit of both. In certain situations, you might see a short burst of rapid change because there's a lot of stress or a really good new opportunity. On the other hand, if an environment changes very slowly, you could see a very gradual change. The other question that this brings up is, how did this all start? The answer is, we have a lot of ideas that we talked about in the Archean. We're not 100% sure, but once it starts, it does go, and it goes quite well. And the last slides I'll leave you with is to note that none of this is random except for some of the mutations, and that ultimately evolution has no end. Life continues to evolve on the planet for species.